The tension was palpable, an unspoken electricity crackling through the air. On one side stood a force of nature, a fighter whose striking power had shattered the bones of many and whose will to dominate seemed unshakable. On the other, an unstoppable juggernaut built like a brick wall and moving with a relentlessness that couldn't be ignored. The stage was set for one of the most anticipated UFC battles in recent memory. Dricus du Plessis vs. Khamzat Chimaev, two warriors who had carved their names into the annals of mixed martial arts with brutal finishes and an unyielding hunger for greatness. But who would reign supreme when the octagon doors closed, and all that stood between them was the unforgiving cage? Du Plessis, with his explosive power and unorthodox fighting style, had turned heads ever since entering the UFC. His aggression was his hallmark, blending a savage striking game with a grappling arsenal that left his opponents scrambling. Each knockout, each submission, solidified his place as one of the most dangerous fighters in the middleweight division. But against Chimaev, would that be enough? Chimaev was a man on a mission. His rise through the UFC had been meteoric, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. A wrestler at his core, Chimaev's suffocating pressure and unrelenting pace had overwhelmed everyone in his path. Yet, there were whispers in the MMA community that this fight might be different. Du Plessis was no ordinary opponent. He was a powerhouse with a chin as tough as granite, and his striking had a unique flair that could pose problems for the usual relentless style that Chimaev brought to the cage. Could the young Russian destroyer handle the chaos Du Plessis was known to bring? As the fight loomed closer, the story of their rivalry began to unfold with an intensity that only increased with each passing day. Both fighters were on the cusp of greatness, each looking to claim the coveted middleweight title that had eluded them for so long. For Chimaev, it was a chance to continue his quest for dominance, to prove that his reign in the UFC was inevitable. For Du Plessis, it was a moment to rise above all expectations, to show that the world was wrong to doubt him. They weren't just fighting for the title, they were fighting for legacy. The training camps were grueling, a battle of wills long before the first bell even rang. Du Plessis had spent countless hours refining his striking, pushing his cardio to the limits, and preparing for the relentless wrestling that Chimaev was sure to bring. Meanwhile, Chimaev focused on his already dangerous striking and continued to refine his wrestling game, preparing for a war on the mat. There was no love lost between the two. This fight was as much about respect as it was about gold. Each wanted to be remembered as the one who stood victorious when the dust settled. And then the moment arrived. The roar of the crowd, the lights flashing, the nerves of the fighters, and just like that, the first round began. From the start, it was clear that this wasn't going to be a typical fight. Du Plessis's hands were fast, his kicks thunderous, and his pressure relentless. But Chimaev wasn't here to be outstruck. His approach was calculated, waiting for the right moment to close the distance and impose his grappling. The first exchange was wild, two powerful men clashing in the center of the octagon. Du Plessis landed a massive hook, but Chimaev shrugged it off like it was nothing. Then, just when it seemed like the tide was turning in Du Plessis's favor, Chimaev closed the gap, grabbing a hold of him like a vice. The crowd collectively gasped as Chimaev's wrestling took over, pressing Du Plessis into the cage and beginning the process of neutralizing his explosive offense. Would this be a repeat of Chimaev's previous fights, where his wrestling suffocated any hope of his opponent's offense? Or would Du Plessis be the one to break through the storm? In the midst of the battle, something unexpected happened. Du Plessis's resilience shone through in a way that no one had anticipated. He wasn't simply surviving the onslaught, he was fighting back with the heart of a lion, refusing to back down. There was a shift in momentum as Du Plessis found a way to create space, landing a few devastating strikes that had Chimaev momentarily rocked. The crowd erupted, unsure of what to expect next. Was this the beginning of the end for Chimaev? Could Du Plessis continue to turn the tables, or would Chimaev's unrelenting pace and pressure wear him down? Just when it seemed like Du Plessis had seized the upper hand, Chimaev's relentless aggression came crashing back. The intensity of the fight was palpable, each fighter pushing his body to the brink, both hungry for victory, both desperate to emerge as the true champion. But with every moment that passed, the question loomed larger: who would break first? As the rounds continued to unfold, the tension between them grew thicker, each exchange more brutal than the last. The fight had become a grueling war of attrition, a battle of wills that left fans on the edge of their seats. The outcome was unclear, the stakes higher than ever before. Neither man was willing to give an inch, but one thing was certain: this was a fight for the ages. And just as the bell rang for the final round, the crowd held its breath, unsure of what would happen next. Would it be Du Plessis's heart and grit that would carry him to victory, or would Chimaev's overwhelming power and precision claim yet another win in his rise to UFC immortality? As the fighters faced off one last time, the air crackled with anticipation. The bell rang, and everything seemed to slow down for a moment. The fighters were bloodied, bruised, and exhausted, yet the fire in their eyes burned hotter than ever. This was no longer just a fight. It was a war, one where each second felt like a lifetime, and the slightest mistake could cost them everything. As they circled each other, the tension was unbearable. Both men had pushed their limits, but now it was time to see who had the heart to outlast the other. Du Plessis's eyes narrowed, his chest heaving with each breath. He knew he couldn't keep absorbing the kind of pressure Chimaev was bringing indefinitely. His strikes had slowed, his movements had become more deliberate, but his will was still unbroken. Every time Chimaev advanced, Du Plessis retaliated with vicious counterpunches, forcing the Russian to back up momentarily, a sight that had become rare in Chimaev's UFC career. But as the round wore on, Du Plessis's strength seemed to wane, and Chimaev smelled blood. In a shocking turn of events, Chimaev made a move that caught everyone off guard. Instead of continuing his aggressive pressure with his typical grappling approach, he switched tactics. He surged forward with unrelenting fury, throwing combinations that left Du Plessis struggling to find his rhythm. It was a shift that no one had predicted. Chimaev, the man known for suffocating his opponents with wrestling, was now showing off his striking. His hands were as dangerous as his wrestling, and he was landing clean shots with precision. Du Plessis, who had weathered the early storms with his chin and heart, was now faced with a different kind of challenge. The cage closed in on him, and Chimaev's strikes were too fast, too calculated. The unexpected twist sent shockwaves through the arena. Du Plessis, who had looked so dominant in the first round, was now fighting with his back against the wall. But just as it seemed like Chimaev was about to seal the deal, Du Plessis found a way to recover. His desperation turned into calculation, and with one unexpected movement, he managed to catch Chimaev off guard with a vicious uppercut that sent the crowd into a frenzy. Chimaev stumbled back, his eyes wide in surprise. For the briefest moment, it looked like Du Plessis might just have the upper hand once again. But the surprise didn't stop there. Chimaev, in a move no one could have anticipated, dropped to the mat and shot for a takedown. This wasn't just any takedown attempt. This was an all-or-nothing effort, as if he knew this was his last chance to regain control of the fight. Du Plessis, still shaken from the uppercut, had little time to react, and within seconds, Chimaev's wrestling game took over. The octagon became a battleground for dominance as Chimaev, now in full control, dragged du Plessis to the ground with frightening speed. On the mat, it was clear that Chimaev's wrestling was on another level. Du Plessis, who had shown such resilience throughout the fight, was now struggling to escape. The crowd roared as Chimaev worked his way into a dominant position, inching closer to locking in a submission. Du Plessis fought with everything he had, but it seemed as if Chimaev had anticipated every move, every escape attempt. The Russian's control was relentless, and with each passing second, Du Plessis's chances of surviving this round seemed slimmer. Then, just when it seemed like Chimaev had this in the bag, an unbelievable turn of events unfolded. As Chimaev moved to transition into a more dominant position, Du Plessis, with his back flat against the canvas, suddenly executed a flawless sweep, flipping Chimaev off him in a moment of pure athletic brilliance. The crowd gasped, the energy in the arena surging once again as Du Plessis, now on top, wasted no time in delivering a barrage of ground and pound. It was an exchange like no other, as if each man was determined to prove that the other would not leave this cage standing. Chimaev, momentarily rattled, was now fighting for his survival on the bottom. Du Plessis's strikes were wild and powerful, yet Chimaev's defense and scrambling ability kept him in the fight. As the clock ticked down, it was clear that both fighters were digging deep into their reserves, pushing themselves beyond what anyone thought possible. With every takedown attempt, with every strike, the question lingered, who would break first? And then, in a moment of complete unpredictability, Chimaev made another shift in his approach. With just a minute left in the round, he managed to scramble back to his feet, using his clinch game to wear down Du Plessis further. But this time, Chimaev wasn't pushing for a quick takedown. Instead, he controlled the distance, circling and waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Du Plessis, drained but not defeated, was still throwing punches, still looking for that one opening that would end the fight in his favor. It felt as though the entire fight had been a slow burn crescendo, building towards something monumental, but neither man had shown signs of giving in. The fans were at the edge of their seats, unsure if they would see a knockout, a submission, or a brutal finish in the final moments. The round ended, and the fighters staggered back to their corners, exhausted, bloodied, but not broken. They had proven they could survive, but as the bell rang for the next round, only one question remained. Who would still have enough left to finish this battle and claim the victory? The stakes had never been higher, and the tension between them had never been greater. Both were on the edge of glory, but which one would tip the scale in their favor? The bell rang, signaling the start of the final round. The fighters, battered and exhausted, stood across from each other, their bodies screaming for rest, but their minds fixated on victory. This was the moment. Neither man had given an inch, and now it was time to see who had the heart to push through the pain and claim the win. Chimaev, who had shifted between tactics throughout the fight, knew this was it, his last chance to dominate. He surged forward, his strikes faster and more brutal than before, pressing Du Plessis back toward the cage. The Russian's relentless pace seemed unstoppable, and for a split second, it appeared as though Du Plessis might crumble under the pressure. But Du Plessis wasn't backing down. His eyes narrowed, and with every strike Chimaev landed, Du Plessis absorbed it, knowing full well that this war wasn't over until the final bell. He needed one shot, one opening, and that's exactly what he was waiting for. In the chaos of the exchange, Du Plessis saw at the slightest dip in Chimaev's guard. It was all the opening he needed. He fired a powerful right hook, followed by a knee to the body that rattled Chimaev to his core. The Russian stumbled back, his eyes wide, and du Plessis didn't hesitate. He closed the distance with the ferocity of a lion, unloading a flurry of punches that had Chimaev on the defensive, his hands now trying to block the storm of strikes. But it was too late. With one final, crushing left hook, du Plessis sent Chimaev crashing to the canvas. The crowd erupted in disbelief. Chimaev, who had been so dominant throughout his career, was now down completely and utterly defeated in a moment of pure chaos. Du Plessis stood over him, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face, but a triumphant grin spread across his lips. He had done it. Against all odds, he had conquered the man who was seemingly unstoppable. But the surprise didn't end there. As the referee moved in to stop the fight, du Plessis stepped back, his eyes scanning the fallen Chimaev. A subtle shift in his expression told the story there was no sense of satisfaction, no celebration of victory. Instead, du Plessis knelt down beside Chimaev, checking on his opponent. In a fight where both men had given everything, where blood had been spilled and bodies had been broken, du Plessis' gesture of respect caught everyone off guard. It was a moment of raw sportsmanship, an acknowledgement of the war they had just fought. Chimaev, still dazed, slowly raised his head and locked eyes with du Plessis. There was no animosity, no bitterness, just a mutual understanding of the battle they had shared. In that fleeting moment, it was clear this fight had been about more than just a title. It had been about legacy, about proving who was truly the toughest. And in the end, du Plessis' heart, his will to survive and conquer, had made the difference. The referee raised du Plessis' hand in victory, but the moment felt larger than just one man's triumph. It was a testament to the spirit of combat sports, the struggle, the resilience, and the respect that exists between warriors, even after the fiercest of battles. Du Plessis had earned his place at the top, but in a twist no one saw coming. He had also earned the respect of an opponent who had once seemed invincible. As the crowd cheered, du Plessis turned to Chimaev, offering him a hand up. Chimaev, though visibly disappointed, accepted the gesture, pulling himself to his feet. There were no words exchanged, but there was something more meaningful in that moment than any speech could ever convey. Both men had given everything in that fight, and it was clear that their paths would forever be linked in the history of the sport. The fight may have ended, but the story was far from over. The echoes of that battle would be felt for years to come, as fans across the world would remember the day when two of the most dangerous fighters in UFC history went to war, and one man emerged not just victorious, but a true champion in every sense of the word. Du Plessis had done what many thought was impossible. He had overcome the beast, and in the process, he had cemented his legacy as one of the greatest fighters to ever step into the octagon. As for Chimaev, he was left to reflect, to learn from this humbling defeat, and to rise again. Because in the world of MMA, even in defeat, there is always the potential for redemption and the promise that the next battle could be the one that reshapes history once again.